just like crazy random and
Yes.
yeah. So to get it started, I would figure like I didn't actually say this in the email, but instead like an intro and a background of like.
Oh, sure.
Because I remember like you were down in Texas and stuff, but I don't know like exactly
Yeah.
like your education, just so
Sure.
people don't think it's a bunch of nobodies.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Okay. So my name is. You're recording?
Yep. That's
Okay.
all good.
My name is Jordan O'Connell. I'm an instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College, an adjunct instructor. But I've been teaching U.S. history for over 10 years and American government for about 5 years. And I've worked previously as a full-time instructor. So this is the third community college I've worked at and taught U.S. history and government classes.
Nice.
Oh, and educational background. Thank you.
No,
So I have a master's degree in American history from the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. And then I went back to school and got 18 graduate credits in political science so I could teach American government, which sort of coincided with Trump's election. So it's been interesting to teach American government these past 5 years.
Dang. I just forgot you had a master's.
Yep. So in that like, I graduated from college and I wanted to work for a year. Like I hadn't made a choice about what I wanted to do necessarily. And I was in a line of work. I was working for student housing in college. As soon as I stepped foot on, my college campus when I was 18 or 19, I thought, this is where I want to be.
Yeah.
I knew it instantly. So I always wanted to stay in school as long as possible.
Yeah.
So I did. So I stayed in college for a fifth year and kind of like took yoga and like various things just to hang on.
Yeah.
And then graduated, but I stayed in student housing. So I worked at the University of Minnesota up in the Twin Cities, which is a good experience when you're like 22 or 23 going to a big city. Did that for a year, but then I realized like I needed to go back to school. So that's when came back across the border to the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire and got that master's degree, which is so rewarding. Like I really enjoy that. And going back for those additional graduate credit hours when I was like 20, how old was I then? I was almost probably 28, 29 28, 29, 30 going back for those graduate credits. It's so rewarding to be in school. And I'd been, working for a couple of years at that point, just being like pursuing the master's degree and just being focused, even though I was working at the same time. Being focused as an adult in school is so rewarding. And if you can do it, right? If you can swing it financially.
Yeah.
And then going back later after I'd been teaching for a couple of years and it was actually online courses I did through Sol Ross for the political science degree. It was great to be like at various stages in my life to be in school.
Yeah.
Like every time it's super rewarding. I'd bring a different perspective, a different comfort level with the experience.
Right.
I mean, part of me would love to kind of keep going.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my colleagues when I was, doing the graduate credit hours in political science, she'd become a faculty member. And she emailed me just a year ago and said, you got the 18 graduate credit hours in political science. I teach for the department now. You should come back and finish the whole master's degree. Like I remember you from our class discussions and stuff. So it crossed my mind, I should just keep going.
Right.
It's not that expensive, you know, but work and kids,
Right.
that sounds like an excuse, and it totally is. Like a better version of me is like constantly enrolled in some class, basically. So and not watching Netflix at 1 in the morning or whatever.
Well, life happens. You can't do everything.
Right. But I wouldn't discount the possibility of pursuing a PhD in the future. But honestly, I think I'd keep working for a couple more years, and the kids get a little bit older, and then do it.
Right.
There's you have to figure out whether it makes financial sense based on the cost and the inputs and all that.
Yeah.
So I remain open to it.
Yeah, especially when you have a mortgage and everything, and you're not
Yep.
basically billless like me. So
Yes. Exactly.
I don't have phone billing, so
You're right.
But
yeah.
So, have you always been interested in government and history, or what got you interested?
It was definitely the 2000 election. So I was in 7th grade, I believe, maybe even younger. But for some reason, something about it was captivating. Honestly, I think it was a civics class that we had to take in junior high. Suddenly I sort of realized that what was happening now sort of would be history, and it was unwritten. I think that was the first moment in my life where I realized the future is persuadable, or it could be changed. And so I paid intense attention to that 2000 campaign, even before the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court decision, all of that. I just paid attention to the campaign. I think because we were talking about it in school, and because I sort of realized it was somewhat history in the making, that it was sort of a pivot point.
Yeah.
And maybe honestly, it being the millennium had to do something with that, because there was so much intense focus on Y2K in the year 2000. I remember what I did the moment the clock turned over to the year 2000. Right, it felt like the seminal moment, and the Soviet Union had fallen. America was this unipolar power all of a sudden. It felt like the world was it felt like a new horizon was kind of dawning. So I think all of that coalesced into me suddenly being interested in politics and history, and it kind of, the focus was definitely that 2000 election, which was insane.
Yeah. Obviously, I was only like, I think 3. So I don't know anything.
But I mean, like, for you,
and,
like 2016 is probably comparable to some extent, like surprise, chaos, right? Yeah. Exactly.
So it was like the end of the world.
A lot of people did in 2016. Yes, they did. Way,
so I was like, oh,
yes,
man.
They did.
But I remember like Obama getting elected.
That was a sea change moment too.
I remember he came to, I think it's Washington, over by Finley, the middle school.
Oh, sure. Okay.
I remember him coming there. We went and we saw him, and it was like, I was like, I think that was like a big kind of shift for me too. Even though at the time I didn't really understand it.
In 2016, people talked about, they tried to compare like Pete Buttigieg to like Obama briefly. Obviously, like that, they're different people, and like history would bear that out. But like those younger people that were hyped up about 2016, I guess it was 2020, like the different candidates, like it's incomparable to the enthusiasm for Barack Obama. Like that was sort of a once in a lifetime thing. You know, I would argue that Obama totally squandered all of that positive energy and that that political capital he had. But that moment of 2008, he was unstoppable.
Like that got did they get a supermajority in the Senate? Because I know they got the House.
They got to 60. It was kind of a fight. So yes, and that's how they passed Obamacare, was getting all those 60 senators. I think that included one Republican. There was a lot of back and forth. I think even one senator sort of changed parties officially during that time to get to 60. So if they weren't at 60, they were essentially there. They were able to get there. That's how they got the Affordable Care Act passed.
Yeah. So like it was just mainly like the 2000 election. Like your parents, were they like any
totally disconnected? I had to convince my parents to vote in that 2000 election. Yes.
Dang.
I actually built a website that an HTML very early website on my 56K dial-up internet, sort of opposing George W. Bush at the time. Like at some point, I was just so passionate for Al Gore. It feels funny to say that now, but I was so enthusiastic, and I dragged my parents to the polls for that election.
That's crazy. Made your own website, like early 2000s.
Yeah, because I mean 2000. I forget the hosting site. I wish I could find all that stuff. It was like GeoCities or something. It's long gone now. Yeah, but. I was doing other childish things, like building websites that made fun of my high school teachers at the same time. That got exposed in school. I had to go do an apology tour.
Oh, my God.
This podcast is really bringing out a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I like it. Oh, man. So if you had to convince someone to, say your parents, who doesn't care about government or history and thinks it's, irrelevant or rigged or anything, what would you say to them?
I used to do that a lot. I used to try to do that all the time. I would constantly, and I'm still known for it to some extent, picking fights with people, because I think, and I do it, and I probably still do it to some extent, a lot less than I used to, but I used to try to debate people, not to be right, but to kind of try to open them up, because I was so passionate about these various topics that I thought I didn't want to give people the choice to just sort of opt out. And so a lot of my youth was spent protesting, literally in college and things like that, holding up signs, doing that kind of thing. I wanted to draw attention and didn't want to give people the option to kind of opt out of the things that I thought mattered.
Right.
But I think I sometimes think about the Vietnam protests as being really counterintuitive, though. And as I've gotten older, I've realized you can't force someone to care, and you can't force someone to not even care, but to understand why they should care. You can't force any of that. Learning has to happen naturally. So you can introduce a subject, but you can't force that. You can't force caring or empower someone to understand why an issue might matter. In fact, you might do the opposite. So in Vietnam, a lot of the anti-war protesters may have inadvertently prolonged the Vietnam War because their tactics were very much viewed as sort of somewhat anti-American. If you feel if you look at the opposition who's trying to introduce a new idea to you, i.e., end the fighting in Vietnam, but their tactics don't appeal to you, it might actually harden you in the opposite perspective. And so I definitely used to try to challenge people in debate all the time, different topics, anyone in my sphere. And that, when I was younger, that looked very much like the early days of Facebook, 2006, fighting with people online and friends and supervisors and instructors when I was in college.
Anyone who would reply.
Basically, yeah. But now, I'm off social media, and I realize I love to talk about these topics, but you have to introduce it, and people have to choose their own mind. So you introduce the concept, you invite people to think critically. I think that's kind of the most you can do to do it. So if topics come up, I happily jump in. But I listen a lot more than I used to talk.
Oh, yeah.
And it's almost the Socratic method, right? You hear someone say something. I did this actually with someone yesterday, they were talking about the price of oil and the profits that oil companies were making with such high oil prices. And I just started asking questions. Well, why is that? And who sets the price of oil, right? And then you can teach someone, or you can invite someone to look critically at their own position without trying to tell them what they should think. And that's definitely what I try to do now.
Yeah, that I learned that too. Like with the 2016 election, I would always argue. Like I remember who it was too. Like a couple friends from high school who were on the other side of me. And we just like argue all the time, and then they actually like changed my mind, so I'm thankful for them. But just like other people, I try to like talk to and like discuss with them, or even debate. Like a lot of time, I was trying to prove people wrong, but eventually it just got towards like people, they're not going to change unless they want to. So I'm like, it's not really.
And you might change someone's perspective, but you're doing it basically at the barrel of a gun when you're trying to argue with them. Basically, like they're doing it under duress, or they're not coming to it naturally. And so even if they sort of do see your perspective, eventually you forced it on them, right? And it'll never resonate in the same way that it would if they came to the realization themselves. It's almost like the Christopher Nolan Inception thing. Like the idea has to be theirs, right? Like they have to adopt it.
Because humans we tend to like, if people attack us, especially something like politics, where it's like a huge core identity for some people, a lot of people nowadays, people will double down and they're like hardened in their beliefs. So it's like, you like you were saying about the Vietnam War, it's like, that's kind of what happened with like MLK Jr. and stuff. Like the people wanted to keep him segregated, but like they'd sick hounds and dogs on like people who were countering him or like marching with him, and people saw that and they're like, that's actually like, we don't support that. We might not want blacks and whites together, but we don't want them to get attacked by dogs either.
Right.
And now you see that nowadays too with certain
tactics really do matter. Yeah.
Like it'll totally turn people off, and so that's why I'm like you said, I listen way more nowadays, and then try to.
It's hard when someone's sort of just saying something that like doesn't make logical sense, or you think they haven't thought through, but they're saying it passionately. Like it's very human to say, "You're totally wrong, and here's why," right? But like they might not be ready for that message.
Exactly. So that's why I could just let people.
That's a them problem, not a you problem. You
gotta focus on you. So.
And you have to focus on people ready to hear the message too.
Right. So. Speaking of more like United States government, what kind of government are we? Are we a democracy, a republic? Are we fascist now?
I just learned a new term. Yeah, that word fascism gets thrown around a lot lately. Oligopoly. I just heard this new term, which is interesting. I don't think that's what we are. I think that we certainly have that tendency toward oligopoly with like basically captured capitalism, right? And I'm describing an economic system, and you're asking about a political system, but one feeds the other. Our political system sort of dictates our economic system, and I think it's sort of a feedback loop to some extent. We're definitely a representative republic. People definitely think we're a democracy. Other people.
So what's the difference between democracy and republic?
I mean, in a pure democracy, the people have direct say over government. With or without representation, like you could have a state or like a municipality that had some level of direct democracy. I think there's some community, is it in New Hampshire? I don't know if it's specific communities in New Hampshire or New Hampshire itself. Town meetings are like public affairs where anyone can speak by the structure of their state constitution, which is interesting. That'd be an example of democracy where sort of everyone has a voice, whether they sort of choose to use it or not, like directly. They can speak to government in an official capacity. What we have is definitely a representative democracy, especially if we're talking about the federal level where, the people have proxies in Washington, specifically as the Constitution was written in the House of Representatives. The Senate was actually a little bit different. The progressives amended the United States Constitution to layer in more democracy. And so there's as the vote has expanded, that's one layer of democracy. As people of color got access to the ballot, as women got access to the ballot through, as that sort of democracy came into the Constitution, there's that. And then there's this other way to view the Constitution and to add democracy to the Constitution through acts like making the direct election of senators, through popular vote, through the states, and also all these suggestions that we somehow make abolish the Electoral College, for instance, as an example of an effort to further democratize the United States Constitution.
Right.
So I'm of the mind that the founders definitely didn't want that they feared tyranny by mob rule, and I very much, and the older I get, the more I realize, I think it's true that populism goes, we see populist movements through much of United States history, different various episodes going back to like Bacon's Rebellion. Donald Trump's a really good example too, that represents a kind of tyranny, the same kind of tyranny that the founders feared when they, abandoned this concept of a king and put a president in his place specifically. And so as we grab onto democracy or start to view it as sort of a panacea, potential solution to our problems, I very much I feel like the founders felt like looking at the government and saying, we have to guard against the concentration of power, and the people are just as capable of doing harm to the republic as a president or as as the Supreme Court or as Congress itself.
Oh yeah. So I don't think a lot of people realize like democracy is a tyranny to a degree. It's like, because if you get 51 people versus 49 people, those 51 people can dictate and tell those other 49 people what to do. Whereas our system, it can be like Iowans do this thing, Minnesotans do that thing, Californians do this thing, and like we have the Constitution, like we all have to follow those, but that's not that much, and we can also all do our own individual things. But I feel like that's fading away, and people just want everybody to do the exact same thing. I'm like,
they really do. They feel like, and this has been a trend in American life for a long time. Like you can see it in media too. Like we have a monoculture, and it really started in the 20th century, and it's been, I think, expedited by technology to some extent. But like everyone watches the same commercials now, and so all news has become nationalized too. So it's big companies sort of dictating all the products we buy. So we have a really similar experience. If you can drive to the western part of Oklahoma or the northeastern tip of Rhode Island and kind of see the same, like America kind of looks the same. Like we've become a monoculture. So it's been kind of makes sense that so many people look to the federal government for solutions to their problems and not the laboratories of democracy, the states. And it goes hand in hand with that they would sort of ask for more democracy because they want national solutions, right? Because everything else is sort of nationalized, media is nationalized, business has nationalized, they think government in itself should nationalize. But again, the founders were so concerned about that. Like that's why the states formed a limited government, a union of states. So basically it all goes back to the Constitutional Convention and what went wrong there and all the all the debates we had there we're having today. And fundamentally, this concept of like positive or negative liberty, I think undergirds all of that. So all of our political debates and differences and nationalization and should we have more democracy, I think whether people fundamentally believe philosophically the government protects liberty or whether government ought to protect rights and expand rights, I think that forms the basis of every major debate we have in the United States today. So calls for more democracy are just sort of a veiled ask of government to expand rights. And the opposite perspective, which isn't nearly as loud, is very much like government, like through its action, actually is capable of reducing rights. And a tyranny of the majority would absolutely do that because 50 plus 1 can trample on the rights of 49.9 if democracy is armed, where at least with the original republic and the separation of powers between the court system, Congress, i.e. the people, and the presidency, the executive, you basically need 66, 2/3 of the government to kind of work in lockstep to advance. And so all this clamoring for like more democracy is really risks putting people in charge, putting democracy at the forefront and abandoning like the checks and balances that we had at the outset. And there will be incredible blowback and consequences if we do that. It'll work to someone's advantage for a while until it is immediately undone by the next administration. And then all we're doing is we're not trying to agree, we're just trying to win, right? Because if you need Congress to write the bill, pass it through both houses, and the president to sign it, you need a lot of coordination and compromise. If all you need is 50 plus 1 to accomplish something, you were just going to try to win elections. That is all that matters. It's not about compromise at all. It's just winning at the cost of everything else.
I mean, you saw that with Obama, like he did so many executive orders, and then Trump comes in next.
Honestly, that example came to mind.
And
absolutely.
Trump comes in next, and it's like he does all those things with the swift of a pen. It's like, okay, like we're just gonna keep having this dogfight back and forth.
Live by the pen, die by the pen. Yeah, right.
And that's why I always try to like people who like in my family who want more like federalized options. I'm like, why don't we just go like state by state? Like California can try this way. Like, let's say California does $15 an hour minimum wage, and Iowa keeps it at whatever we're at. Like, let's just see, give it a few years, and then we can adopt instead of like putting all of our eggs in one basket and then trying to just force it. Because if it goes wrong, well, then everybody's screwed. Whereas if it just goes wrong in Iowa, then we can get some help from other people.
And Iowa is not California, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Vastly different economies. Again, like the
weather,
idea that we ought to have more democracy and that we should abolish the electoral college and all of those proposals like that sort of rely on the assumption that it's the same everywhere and that it ought to be. And so if you disagree with that, you start to realize, or if you sort of do realize that economies are local and people are different, then you can't do that. That isn't your impulse. I said earlier that America starts to look the same with, Hobby Lobby, everywhere and and a chicken place everywhere or whatever. It's true from the interstate, but you got to get in, right? Just because it looks the same everywhere. Like if you actually drive into communities and talk to people, people are vastly different. They really are in the United States. They have very different histories, different goals, and we tend to think of it in terms of like red and blue, but it's deeper than that. You just got to get off the interstate. Just because America looks the same doesn't mean that it actually is the same when you go talk to the people.
Yeah, there's so many more levels and depths to everybody, and so much more than just like black and white. So it's like you got to.
How would a minimum wage in New York City work? Versus Dubuque, Iowa. Like how could it be the same?
California, but it might also not then work in Iowa. So it's and like maybe there's a degree like California works because this and that. And
California has so many tech billionaires and all these companies making money hand over fist. Like they have the local economy to maybe support policies that other places certainly don't.
Yeah.
Iowa probably can't afford a $15 an hour minimum wage. Our businesses don't make profits like California businesses
not
do.
Even close, yeah. And there's like 33 million people in California, and there's like 3 million in Iowa. So
right.
And half of them are farmers. So.
Right. All right. Yeah.
But just like one more thing on the democracy thing,
sure.
I always try to like if I'm talking to some of my family members, I'm always like trying to convince, like look at them and be like, well, look at slavery. Like that was a federal government thing, and they took away their rights. And if you get like a direct democracy, it can turn into that tyranny again, and you should just want like checks and balances in place instead of like just having.
But critics would say that it was the states that championed slavery, and so like the counterpoint to what I just said is very much like states have very much to use state power to. I mean, slavery is an extreme example, but it's a real one. But to do an injustice to their citizens, and we're seeing a lot of that discussion with the Dobbs decision and the overturn of Roe v. Wade. But if federal politicians, and if we trust elections to like render judgment, then I think we have to trust state elections to do the exact same. Like, and those people are closer to their constituents than the representatives in Washington. Right. And so if government's going to be accountable to the people, if we're going to get state government action that is unacceptable to a group of people, i.e. the state, like they're much closer, like the consequences will be sharper and faster at the local level. So all those southern states that championed slavery, they were literally doing the will of the people, or at least a supermajority of the people in those states, even though a supermajority of white Southerners were not slave owners. They were exercising the democratic will of the people at the state level. So democracy can run amok. So, but critics, I would say, well, that's why we need the federal government. We need democracy, but not at the state level. We need it at the federal level. But the counter argument to that is what you described earlier, which is you'll undo it with the stroke of a pen, or the next election will come around, and then we have policy that is just all over the map. Like other countries can't coordinate with us because we are, speaking in different voices every 4 years. We have a rapidly, we say one thing, and then 4 years later we say something entirely different, which a lot of countries are grappling right now with under the Biden administration. It's so radically different than the Trump administration. We already have the pendulum swinging so fast at the national level. Currently, more democracy will mean more erratic government at the federal level for sure.
Yeah. Man, I could go on
I know,
that forever, but so why are we set up in the representative republic? Why are we set up like that?
The founders understood. I think the founders understood much better than we do today. Like, human weaknesses.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe they're just more religious or something like that.
I
But
think at the time too, they were dealing with the king, and now we have such comfortable lives.
that too, but like a lot of people on the left today would liken, the administration of Donald Trump to a king, right? And you'd think that would make them fear fear the government more, but so many critics of Donald Trump actually want a stronger government. So the lesson doesn't resonate in the same way for whatever reason. So it's got to be bigger than just King George III. But anyway, they understood. Maybe they were just more philosophical. Maybe they just spent more time thinking about these concepts. Certainly they were better read and better educated to some extent.
They probably all knew like Latin at least.
Right. They were much, I think, honestly, the argument is they were much more familiar with European history and global history, and those insights that you gain, not that I'm an expert on that at all, but the insights you gain from looking at like ancient civilizations is just empires being built and empires falling, because of hubris or a lack of faith or control or sort of whatever it is. And so the lesson that I believe the founders took away from their understanding of history and the writing of the U.S. Constitution and even the Articles of Confederation before it was humans are deeply flawed. And whether they believe that people were sort of innately good or innately bad, it goes back to those philosophical arguments like Edmund Burke and others. They needed to protect against the potential for human failure.
Right.
And so dividing government and forcing compromise and slowing government by requiring, the government to coordinate with itself, not only to advance, but again, to protect against the concentration of power in any one branch.
Yeah.
And so divide government against itself, make it a republic where government would need to coordinate in order for anything to happen.
Right.
Intuitively, they understood that government would be slow and limited as a result. Government has grown significantly despite those protections, but they definitely did it because they understood the human condition.
Yeah.
And I think for some reason, like we very much believe today that humans are capable of greatness, and I suppose that's positive, but we really, by trying to arm the ordinary citizen with more and more power, we're very much giving the ordinary citizen a ton of credit. I think that is unearned.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Big time.
Yes. And then I always like try to question people. It's like, well, what if the person you disagree with had that same power? Like,
there's like a short-termism,
Yeah.
and I'm struggling to understand where that comes from too. But I would hate to say it's social media or something like that, but there's a short-termism when it comes to politics, economics, policy. We see it in in companies too. Like we're seeing all these American companies like using money for stock buyback purchases, like the markets, like global like trading markets and like American companies, like mega corporations are very much looking ahead, basically only one quarter.
Yeah.
They're not looking forward in the same way that I think people used to.
Yeah.
I can't pin why that is exactly.
Yeah.
Why we're so interested in just the next quarter, just the next election. But it does seem endemic throughout all of America, basically. Like we have become normalized. It's cultural, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like we are in an age of what's next.
Yeah.
And that's definitely driving a lot of, I don't want to care about the future or what the political consequences of this decision might be. I just want to pack the Supreme Court right now because I don't like their decisions.
Yeah.
So I think then to win the argument, like you have to try a different tactic. If people don't care about the future like we might say they ought to, then the debate has to change to some extent.
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to debating people like, what are they ready to hear?
Right.
I don't have an answer to that, RJ. Like what's next or how do you convince someone? But if they don't think the future matters or they're not thinking about like the continued health of the United States like 100 years from now, then we have to try a new tactic.
Yeah.
And the debate has to change somehow.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's like, there's this guy, Peter Zion. He's actually from Iowa, but he's this huge geopolitical analyst and consultant. And he says we're going through like a period right now that America's gone through like 7 kind of times. And like we're like halfway through, and then afterwards we'll kind of be like more sane again. So that's like one hope I'm hoping for, but I'm just like, I don't know. Like
I think there's some truth to that. Like that idea, I really struggle with this personally, and I keep coming back to markets, but markets express like I learn a lot about human nature and this country by sort of watching, not stock prices, but like what companies are making money, what makes money, what sells in America, like what are people buying. And I've been struggling with this concept of myself of like trying to look at like so my life, like I described earlier, paying attention to politics since roughly the year 2000. So right now it's the year 2022. So I have this 22-year window of actual experience of paying attention. But I also teach U.S. history and talk about like, bigger sea changes in history. And you can look at different episodes. Think about the slavery debate. Like it took Americans a long time and a lot of arguing and fighting, and then literally fighting to settle slavery. So someone could have been born in the year 1820, let's say, and their whole life was dominated by this slavery debate, no matter like what side of the debate they were on. And for them, it would be like that's what America is. It's always going to be like this. We're always going to argue about slavery. Like nothing can change. True, nothing's different. Like slavery is either important or it's an evil. It doesn't matter like what side of the debate they were on. But their whole life up until like that Civil War could have been dominated by that issue. And that's what America was to them. It was all slavery. Oh, yeah. Right? And so in the same way, like America today, I can't help but think that it's possible that you and I, and particularly I, because I'm older than you, have just lived in this age of polarization. Yeah. And that polarization has been incredibly normalized, but it's not the natural state of affairs. Yeah. Right? Like we might be living through this incredibly long episode that I can't see clearly beforehand, and I can't see clearly what's happening next. Right. But what happened before and what happens after is significantly more important than the moment, this 25-year moment I've been living in. So everything that's sort of normalized in the way that I conceptualize like my fellow countrymen and all of that might be entirely tainted by this episode we're in the middle of, right? That it's all I know, and so I don't know anything different. So it's quite possible that you're correct, that we're living through like in the post like Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, Newt Gingrich, like the culture wars of the 90s have bled into this, and this is almost over. Like that's quite possible that like in 3 years, like none of this matters anymore. Right. And that we're not having these inane debates about whether we should pack the Supreme Court or not. We will realize some great truth like after it, or we'll come to some consensus. I won't even call it a great truth, but a consensus will emerge where none existed for a generation. Yeah. And then we all move on. Yeah, like that's quite possible that we're in a moment, like this moment that feels like a lifetime, but it's just a moment.
Yeah, because I mean, like nothing's ever stagnant. Everything always changes. So that's why I think we're like, it's just a waste. Like this will happen again in the future. Maybe not in our time, but like in our kids' and grandkids' time, it'll happen again. But I think it'll pass. It's just like I want it to pass now. Like,
right, but you can't. But you're kind of you don't have control over it, and neither do I. Right? Yeah. Hopefully, it does pass. Right. The polarization is not. It's good to debate, but it's not good to like so many of our fights aren't debates. They're they're just bickering,
trying to one up each other. And
right. We're trying to win, not learn or grow. Yeah. Yeah. We're so focused on winning.
Yeah. And so it's just chaotic. But so speaking of Roe v. Wade, what was it like? What does Supreme Court overturning do? I don't even really know like what it was. I remember because it's not in the Constitution, but like in the 70s or whatever, that Supreme Court at the time said it was constitutional.
So the court, I have tremendous respect for the Supreme Court. I actually got to watch oral arguments just about a year before COVID hit. I was in Washington D.C. and we did the rigmarole to randomly show up to a case being argued before the Supreme Court. So like regardless of any decisions or whatever, I just have tremendous respect for the court and its role in our republic. So the court has to do they're the academic angle on all this. Like they're looking at like case law, precedent, not just the Constitution, but they're the historical lens like we should look to during like tumultuous times. Like they can be like a rock in the center of chaos and uncertainty in the political realm. The court we should do absolutely everything we can to keep the court insulated from politics because they're the ones looking back and trying to understand the past and reconcile the future, or the present rather, with the past for the benefit of the future. So the Roe decision came about, like abortion had been like litigated, some states had it legalized. I think there probably weren't a ton of laws in the books for states where it was legal. I don't think any states were outwardly trying to legalize it. I could be wrong about that, but certainly states were trying to restrict access to abortion before 73. And so that's when the Roe decision made its way to the court, and the court takes on cases that it thinks will help settle big debates like in American life. And so what they found was that a majority of the court found that a woman's right to privacy, as understood through prior case law found in the 14th Amendment, which is actually a post-Civil War amendment about slavery. If you read the text of it, it describes the right to privacy and due protection from interference. Their reading of the 14th Amendment and other decisions they'd made up until that point that incorporated the 14th Amendment, they found that a majority, even though they disagreed on some of the logic, that it offered women protection to choose an abortion. But they also had to reconcile, I think it was the state of Texas, the state's right to make its own laws, basically. So they came up with this trimester framework. So the court does this routinely, which is really, really interesting. You can see it with the Voting Rights Act. The court won't only make decisions, it will come up with standards and formulas to try to give guidance to individuals and states. The Lemon test was this early qualifier that the court came up with to help states determine if certain speech was protected or not. So some states, I know I'm changing topics, but I'll come back to abortion. Some states, for instance, continue to have to, less so now, seek permission from the Department of Justice if they're going to change their election laws as a result of the decisions in the 60s by the court to not punish states, but to set states right when it came to their efforts to stop certain people from voting. So they can make decisions, but they can also enforce those decisions and provide legal frameworks by which states have to comply. So in this instance, going back, to the Roe decision, they literally came up, the court, not a group of experts of women's health or birth at all, came up with the trimester framework to try to explain this. And so it allowed women within a certain time frame a protected right to an abortion. So what that did was it didn't give women the right to an abortion or the right to seek an abortion or acquire an abortion, but it stopped states from being able to restrict abortion procedures within that framework for a certain amount of time. And I actually don't exactly know. It was definitely the first trimester. And then there are all sorts of caveats and rules around that too. And so states have creatively, for 50 years, a lot of people feel really passionately about this, tried to, within the legal limits, continue to restrict abortion as much as they possibly can. One thing that I know Texas was doing, for instance, was abortion providers had to have, they were just throwing up legal administrative hurdles to this. You have to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital if you're going to perform abortions in the state of Texas, meaning you have to go through all this legal paperwork, basically, in case something were to go wrong with the abortion and she needs to be rushed to an emergency room at a nearby hospital, So states have been fighting, the Roe decision for a long time. They've been abiding it, but they've been fighting it for a long time. So it's all grounded in the incorporation of the 14th Amendment, which some of the justices who concurred with the opinion actually said, we should have incorporated the 9th Amendment with this. So there was an incredible debate about Roe at the time, but basically everyone accepted the court's decision begrudgingly and tried to find ways to work around it.
So it was never a right, but they just kind of saw in the Constitution that women can do it within a certain time period, and the states couldn't stop them.
We would definitely need to talk to a lawyer about whether it was incorporated as a right. It became a recognized right, I might argue, based on their interpretation of the 14th Amendment. But Supreme Court cases can be overturned. And Democrats had an opportunity in the Obama years.
They did.
They had an opportunity to codify this into actual law. The court. The court can make decisions, but when the court goes too far in attempting to write the law, I'm trying to be very careful with my words here, recognition of rights through only the Supreme Court that aren't grounded in actual law, just in case precedent, is always super tenuous.
You're right.
So because the court can undo it, because Congress can pass a law or the Constitution can be amended. So anything that the court decides, and if we're going to call it a right, if abortion was a right that women had from 1973 through 2022, it was always tenuous for 50 years. And there were opportunities where Congress or the people themselves could have amended the Constitution to codify this. Or with Congress, they could have just passed a law as well, and they failed to do so. So the court changed its mind, which it can do. So it rested on the court, and then the court changed its mind.
And what was the reasoning for the overturning? What did
they totally invalidated all the logic. So that 1973 decision was super tenuous. They had to sort of fight their way there. They got there and they agreed on that principle, but all the the dissents at the time pointed out some of the logical, I won't even call it leaps, but the assumptions they were making about the 14th Amendment and this right that they were granting. And so critics for almost 50 years have been resting on that and saying, hey, you got it wrong. Right. And so when we have a favorable slant on the court, when we have enough people that agree with us, and not even politics, but when people see that the logic is actually different, or that I can't see that in the 14th Amendment, we'll just overturn it. It's your example of the executive
executive order.
Executive order, thank you. I was going to say executive action. It's exactly that for the Supreme Court. So it took 50 years to turn, but when it turned, they instantly look back at the decision and say, that's not true. Right. The dissent was actually right. Like that logic isn't there. And so now we'll see a couple of different cases that have rested on that logic are now, if they're taken up by the court, will likely change as a result.
Stuff, right? Yeah. And so they just, like the Supreme Court justice today, just saw the 73 justices' logic of being wrong. So theoretically, like Clarence Thomas could say, yeah, abortion's a right, but you're just doing it the wrong way.
Sure.
Right? Like you went through it the wrong way. If you guys put it through Congress and get an amendment, then it's totally fine. But the logic that you used to get there was not logical.
And we have to remember that the Supreme Court it's always a case. It's always someone suing someone else, right? And so they're looking at a very narrow instance. But that's where all that logic comes into play, right? So like it's always bigger than just like whether, and people forget this, but it's almost irrelevant how the justices feel about a particular issue. They're looking at the law and then, the lawsuit that's in front of them specifically. It often has big ramifications, especially if they're overturning a previous precedent. But it's irrelevant whether Clarence Thomas thinks abortion is correct or moral or amoral. It's all about what the Constitution says and how it can be interpreted, right? And so Alito was very careful. Like I skimmed through the decision, like it's crystal clear that, basically Alito's point is, I can't find the logic for this in the United States Constitution. It's not there currently. If it were amended, it would be there currently, and then it would be clear. If a law were passed, it would be clear. So this is the domain of the state specifically, who are free to expand that right or limit that right.
I think people just like
they feel a right has been stripped from them for
that
sure.
Was never there, and it's like, well, you guys were just played.
But it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and just people like, you guys can put it in the Constitution. You just gotta get like the senators and the House on board. And it's like, that might be really hard right now, but it's not. I don't know. People just.
I empathize. Like I really do. Like personally, I'm definitely pro-choice. Like I would like the government out of that issue and a million other issues actually. People feel really strongly on the moral side of it. And so it's best with the local government, like I would argue, like whoever's closest to the people, it would be best there. But I do sympathize with the argument. I think there's something to be said for the other side, which very much argues, like, if you believe fundamentally that it is and ought to be like a protected right, and if you do feel like you're in the minority, like I always empathize with the minority position. So if you can't get Congress to pass a law, and if your state does make it illegal, like the state has taken what might be argued as a natural right from you. Like the state is limiting you by making it illegal to you or inaccessible to you. So I honestly sympathize with the argument, but you have to use the existing structure of government to do it. And you can't rest on a court decision that can be overturned in the same way that you can't rest on an executive order. Change the law, right? Change the law.
Yeah. And I wish more people would just realize that. Like,
it's tough, It's hard for me to believe that the Dobbs decision actually came through. Like, I never thought I'd see that day. Like, I had just recorded a bunch of U.S. history lectures where I talked about Roe. Like, instantly, and this always happens. I always find this in life. When I do something, things change. Like, when the moment I'm more sure that something is sort of set, that's when it changes.
So don't talk about gay marriage, because I don't think our country could handle that. But at the same, like with gay marriage and Roe and like abortion and stuff, I feel like most Americans are pro gay marriage and pro at least like first trimester choice. When you get to like
I
9
think
months
you
and
are
stuff,
correct.
like
Yes.
I even talked to some of my family members about like abortion and whatnot, and they're like, like they're very passionate pro-choice, but it's like, once it's like 7, 8, 9 months, it's like that's too much. That's too far. And
that does seem to be where the mainstream is. But I think a lot of and I'm actually surprised we haven't seen a more fervent response to the Dobbs decision.
Oh my gosh, I know.
because it was unthinkable just a few years ago. But if you believe that like the federal government is going to save you, and like if it's going to be the agent of justice and democracy for you, and the federal government fails you, like that's what's so vexing for so many people right now in this moment is the court is now slanted in a direction that they generally don't support. And so their saviors, i.e. the federal government, the people they want to bring democracy, to nationalize, to unify the United States, that's now under, that option isn't available to them. And so it's scary for folks who think that the solution to a lot of our problems is just greater nationalization, to realize that you can't do that. Like, no longer is that door open to you. Like, government isn't speaking in one voice any longer.
Right.
You can't reliably trust Congress and the executive to just keep expanding federal power if the Supreme Court is actually saying, actually, stuff that's been true for 50 years, we don't agree, any longer. The reversing trend. And the Supreme Court has done this from time to time. Obviously, composition of the court matters. And, during the 60s, the court really leaned in the other direction, protecting the rights of minorities and all of that. Right. So the court is definitely it's a cycle. It's going through a sort of the opposite cycle currently.
Yeah. And that's what I would say to people, like, you had it in the 60s and now the other side has it now. And so it's like, why don't we just actually dial back all the power?
Yeah, sure.
And put it to the states, and then California can do whatever they want. Texas can do what they want.
Or do the hard work of trying to actually legislate at the national level and not try to get rid of the filibuster, not stack the Supreme Court, not get rid of the Electoral College. Instead of trying to change the rules of the game, just play. Play the game. And I'm not even talking about politics, but just like understand it and follow the rules.
Right.
And see how you do, right? Like an honest test of your ideas and your solutions. Like have it go through the machinations of government. It's hard for people. It goes back to that short-termism, I think. Yeah. Like, no one likes compromised government.
Oh, no.
But it's the only honest way to move forward. Yeah. It's the only way you actually move the needle. There's actually a third party. I didn't read anything about it, but there's something called the Forward Party now. And this happens every election cycle. There's I think Andrew Yang is sort of leading this effort, and they have no policies. They call themselves the Forward Party, and they're trying to sort of unify. So that's the right impulse. Like, I don't like what I think centrists often put forward. I'm thinking about like Joe Manchin and others specifically, but it has to be, we have to stomach it. Like, if no one's happy, that is the only way we advance in government. Like, you can't win. Like, if you win, you win now, you're just going to lose later. Yeah. So like, I'm rambling a little bit, but but that's how we move forward, is through the ugly work of like compromise. Yeah. Like, that is how we have lasting change.
And I don't even think there's much compromising. Like, I feel like most people agree a lot more on most things. You just hear the extremes of both sides, and then you think we're super divided. But it's like, I don't know. I just feel like more people are way more centrist than we realize, and they'll like be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's like, I might be pro-life, but I can understand the, first trimester. Yeah. I don't know. I
think you're probably right. Well, again, this goes to the nationalization of our politics. Like, we see like everyone's today, as of like August 1st, 2022, people are very interested in what one Arizona senator is going to do about this law specifically. And so we see like outside money pouring into different like elections and like at the state level. So that's all, I would argue that's what you're describing, the phenomenon of people generally being sort of moderate and amenable and being willing to sort of, understand another person's perspective and lose sometimes when it comes to politics if they trust the system. I think that the greater power is concentrated in D.C. and away from the states specifically, the greater the stakes are. That's what pushes senators specifically, who are supposed to be more reserved, more patient than the House. That's what pushes Congress and certainly the presidency toward polarization in politics, or toward trying to win, because it's everything has become so nationalized. Like, they can win if they exert enough influence and power, and they're just thinking about their legacy or their time in Washington. Like, that was sort of an incoherent point. I'd have to think more about that.
I
have to organize my thoughts a little bit more about that topic.
Yeah, I just think people, they just don't realize it is the thing. Like, the more I talk to more people, I realize like my judgments about them first weren't right. Like, I'd assume certain things, and not in a negative way. It's just like, I feel like if you believe this, then you're probably gonna believe that. But it's like, it's not negative. Like, believe what you want. And then I listen to them, I'm like, oh, like, you agree with this person on this thing and disagree on this thing. So it's like, I don't know. People just agree, I think, way more than they realize. It's just you always get the negatives because that's what gets publicity and clicks and all that.
I think I understood the point I was trying to make earlier. Like the nationalization of politics means that like people representing our interests in Washington don't particularly care about that moderate point of view. They're caring about their party and then the party's national prospects specifically. And so it actually becomes about winning on behalf of the party rather than like the interests and a moderation of the people. Because all of a sudden, because everything is so nationalized and all of these national votes matter so much and the government is so big, one lowly senator's vote, Senator Sassy from the state of Nebraska, what he thinks about a particular policy issue has all these national the more that we nationalize, the more that any representative who's supposed to be representing the interests of a smaller group of people become the interests of the American public. Like look at Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, others like that. All of a sudden, the whole republic and the direction of the republic rests because we're so polarized, because everyone wants to win on what a handful of people want to do. And so that moderation that you're describing, that's not the most important thing. Suddenly, it's I have to represent the 50.1%. Otherwise, people are going to show up at my house and protest, right? Otherwise, people from out of state are going to come in on buses and threaten me, and that's an extreme example. But basically, because politics has nationalized, it makes it's harder for people to say I don't care about that nonsense. I care about the people who sent me to Washington. That's my point. There we go.
Okay, that's very true though, because like. Who do we have? Ernst and I don't know.
Who's the other Iowa senator? Grassley.
I thought he was governor. Who's our governor?
It was Kim Reynolds.
Oh yeah.
There we go.
You're good. So but they should. I don't get the whole. I mean, granted, there's also like money influence where it's like, oh, you can get Grassley on this thing or Joan Ernst on this thing, and so.
But I mean, but I think, it's both parties have allowed politics to be nationalized. And so one of the first things I was describing when we started this was just like how much DC matters to the people. Like we've all gone along with it, and now everything that happens in DC is ultra meaningful, and now the interests of the individual districts are inconsequential. And part of that would be like I could point to gerrymandering. There's a couple of issues that I think people could really unify on, and I think gerrymandering would be one.
I think gerrymandering's number one thing.
There's someone of the sort of opposite political persuasion in my life, and we totally agree. And I've agreed with his points about gerrymandering, the potential distortions that happen as a result of gerrymandering, including House members just being elected over and over and over again. That definitely has to have ripple effects on the nation, and probably on the concentration of power in DC, because the more safe that especially House seats are, the more likely it is for House members to not give a damn about what their district thinks or believes, and to not accept that level of moderation. It's all about the national politics. It's all about moving up within the Democratic or Republican Party, doing what Donald Trump or Joe Biden wants you to do. That's the consequence. I'm glad it came around to that point, because I was flubbing there for a little bit.
But I think gerrymandering, and there's something, I think it was, we talked about it, limits on
term limits. That's an interesting one too.
Because, Ted Cruz and AOC had a tweet about that. They're like, oh yeah, we can get together on this. It's
I remember that exchange.
Two polar opposite people.
But that's the potential of compromise, right? If you can do that, then you've created something lasting, right? Even if no one loves the end product, even if it gets filled with pork spending or whatever happens to that bill that gets finally gets 65 or 70 senators on board or whatever. The CHIPS Act might be a really good example. That I think that's about to be signed by the president today. Some people really fervently disagree with it. Philosophically, I sort of get their point, but it has 70 or 75% senators on the side of this bill. That's the kind of thing we need for people to trust the government again. Whether the government's always doing good or bad, trusting government is important. Even if you're an anarchist, you want a government, unless you're a true anarchist, I think you want a government that is accountable to some extent and is unified to some extent. That's a sign of national strength. So even if you're an anarchist and you hate government, I think you at least want a people that kind of speak through the government, whether you like what they're saying or not. And what we have a lot of the time when we are just bickering about issues and everything is nationalized, we're passing things with this simple majority that only last a few years. Government's not speaking in one voice. What's the expression? It's sheep talking about, wait, what's the example? I'm gonna struggle with this. The sheep and wolves asking what's for dinner, basically around the table, trying to figure out like what's for dinner.
Yeah, there's like 2 wolves and 1 sheep, and
right. That's what we have right now.
Yeah.
And, yeah, we have enough sheep that we could overpower the wolves.
Oh, easy,
we really could, but the wolves are just. We've elected the wolves to lead us in a lot of instances and given them the power.
Wolves are very smart and use they'll take one subject that people are really polarized on, like abortion, and they'll make that the party issue versus gerrymandering, where it's like probably 99%
exactly.
People.
Yes.
So it's like I wish like the American citizens like took a step back, like checked themselves and like realized, like took a more objective stance and like say like, okay, abortion's important to me, but so is gerrymandering. Let's at least get this win together. Like, let's do that.
I read a quote on Twitter yesterday that said something like, I'm just one person. What can I do? Said 300 million people.
Yeah. Right.
About an issue, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
But people just get those big important ones that everyone's divided on. But hopefully people start to realize that.
If you believe you have a voice, or rather, like if you believe you have some measure of accountability, like if you kind of connect yourself to the government and start to realize that, like, not even like how you vote, right? Like, again, this goes back to democracy and how I think it's sort of like a false god to some extent. Like, if you believe that, like, it's how you live your life and your relationships, if like all that matters more than just like what you do on a random day, like in November on a Tuesday. If you start to see like your role in this country as bigger than just voting a certain way on election day, and more about like who you are, what you do, how you spend your money, like all of that matters, like to the future of the republic. I'm not trying to make like Amazon purchases like some significant thing, but basically like it's bigger than democracy and just voting. You know, and if you start to see that you actually have a role and you do matter in the system, then suddenly like the conversations you have with other people like across from a table like resonate and matter and can change the course of the republic. You know, so it is stepping back and looking at it, but it's just realizing the power that you already have. You just don't think that you do. Right.
Everyone thinks there's just one individual. It's like, no,
you turn on the TV and you think that the agenda is already set, but it's not. Like the agenda is set because you're not saying anything. It's exactly right. Exactly.
People, they want you to be like, what's it? It's like a doomer. That's like a meme where it's like you're only negative. You think everything is already set. Like the World Economic Forum already has everything planned out. Doomer mindset where you don't like think you can do any change. It's like, no, like everybody has way more power than
everything can change tomorrow.
Yep. Oh man.
We're getting philosophical here.
Very. What are some common misconceptions about U.S. government or history you wish people would like unlearn?
Some misconceptions?
Yeah.
Definitely the democracy will save us. Like democracy could actually doom us in the same way that empowering the presidency, you know, even beyond the growth of power of the executive in the 20th century could doom us in the same way that, I don't know, like empowering Congress even further could doom us. So the people are almost like a fourth branch. I mean, they're involved. Like Article 1 of the Constitution is Congress and the House. Like we have our say in Washington through the House. Like if we held our representatives accountable, we have enough democracy. Like in order for legislation to be passed, like the people have to abide it already. So democracy, like that is taken care of, and more democracy will not save us. Specifically, in fact, it could harm us. That's one major one. Other misconceptions, again, that somehow voting is significant or important. The other 364 days of the year are arguably more important, right?
Especially when there's not an election that year.
And I think it all comes down to that. Also, the potential of government to like solve problems in general, like that is grossly overstated. Like government has so many unintended consequences for the policy. If you see a couple of those, if you open your eyes to that, not that people have their eyes closed or whatever, but if you can connect those dots, or someone helps connect those dots, that like no policy is going to be perfect. And in fact, like it's going to like have consequences for some people. I think you start to realize then that like action by government can't make the world fair or, you know, or perfectly safe or anything like that. Like there is common sense legislation that government should consider and pass, but it should be from the center. It should be moderate. It's not going to be perfect still. Like that's the only way we sort of move forward as a country. That's what progress looks like. Middling compromise. Like that is the best we can get from government, and everything else where we're trying to sort of swing for the fences each time, like we're just going to keep striking out, right? And we're going to lose the
Garden of Eden and make a utopia. It's like, how about we just do like a little bit,
right?
Like
the path toward Eden is through compromise. I would argue, like eventually, like totally,
it's so. Also, what are then some ideas or facts or like anything you wish people would know more?
People should definitely read the Constitution.
Yeah.
Because it resonates. I send it out to students that take U.S. government with me. I'll send a little paper copy because it's so much shorter than they think it is.
Yeah, it's
and like, there's not a ton of philosophy in there except in like the preamble and other places, but like it communicates that concern over the concentration of power, in a way that we accept as normal today, that the concentration of power will somehow help us, or that's the solution to some of these big disagreements. If only the national government would just take care of this for us or save us. It communicates just how dangerous the concentration of power is indirectly. It doesn't say it directly, but through the division of powers, it communicates that, I think, in a way that that is so different than the way that we think about government today. It would have to give one pause, basically. Like, well, why? Everything I think government should do, they're saying government shouldn't do. They're dividing all these powers and making everything so difficult. They're making, why did they think gridlock was so good? And we hate it so much today, right?
Right. It's because people, I don't know, people think on both sides that there's not consequences. They're like, oh, I'm just right. Like, everything's going to go well. And it's like,
or if I could only, my policy preferences on these couple of issues, if I could only get those passed, and if we just jam those things will be better. No, they won't. Like you have these preferences, but you don't know how things will go in the future. And not only that, like those things could be reversed, but they might not have the effect that you want it to. I'm thinking of like in the early 2000s, there were efforts by Republicans to like cut spending. They assumed would lead to like a smaller government, right? But then we just started like borrowing the money to pay for government specifically, and so like. Yeah, so like you might be really confident that you have a solution to a problem, and then you might accomplish it, but it might not actually do anything. It might actually make the problem worse specifically, so.
Well, there's like a saying that it's not that if it's not broken, don't fix it, but just like something along the lines of consequences and, things are more likely to like, it's harder to change things and make it go good than like change things and make it. It's more likely that something bad will happen, basically, than like having such a complicated system and trying to change it and making it better. It's much harder for things to like deteriorate and break down and fall apart than
if you start like tinkering with it, basically, right? Right, sure, yeah.
That's why I think like it's like, okay,
even like a broken machine that's kind of running is better than a machine that you've brought to a standstill to try to fix or something.
It's like it might not be perfect, but let's try to like keep what we have. And then slowly,
it is old machinery. It's we have the oldest like republic, or democratic form of system of government through the Constitution that still exists. Yeah, like in manufacturing and like machines. Like if you shut down a machine, the odds are to try to repair something like it might not start up again, right?
Yeah.
Like it's better to try to, if at all possible, just keep that machine going.
Yeah.
Kind of figure it out on the fly, right? Stop trying to stop trying to sort of you can tinker with it,
right?
But like don't just shut it down because you're sure that you're going to fix a thing, right?
Right. It's not. Yeah.
Shutting it down might create a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. I just, especially like, I mean, young people. I was even in this way too, so I'm not like bashing anybody, but we just don't realize, especially like every month I feel like I'm a new person.
Yeah.
Because I grow so much. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that a month ago. And you just keep growing, and then you realize like, oh, there's way more consequences. And like, but when you're young, you have like, like the utopian kind of vision, and we just do this, we'll be good. But
we still might get back to that utopian vision.
Right.
I was thinking about this honestly on my walk here. I was just thinking about like, I think it's probably harder for people, and hopefully this isn't you at all. I don't think that it is. It's hard to have like genuine growth and to realize like some level of humility would do so many politicians so good, and so many partisans, maybe that's the word I'll use, not just politicians but people so sure that their policy prescription, like we just need this policy or whatever. Like humility is constructive, and it doesn't have to mean like the realization that you're wrong doesn't mean you have to give up. There's someone in my life who when she's wrong, she very much sort of goes through a phase of like, I'm wrong about everything, right? And you probably know those people too.
I was that person. That when my first big thing, like learning about economics and like the 20th century and how certain economic policies led to like these kind of deaths and stuff. I'm like, whoa, like I was wrong on that, and that was a huge wrong.
Sure.
So then I went back and looked at everything else. But nowadays it's like, well, I might be wrong on this thing. I'm pretty confident on this thing. Like I won't have to reevaluate my entire life.
Right. It's not the end of the world when you're
Yeah.
wrong, especially if you're willing to grow. Then you're still ahead of the curve. It might feel like,
Yeah.
oh, well, I was in the wrong, and so the majority were right, and therefore maybe I'm not as capable, or maybe I don't have the insight I thought I did. But don't let yourself think that, because then you'll stop growing.
Yeah,
like you have to grow.
Yeah, with the humility and with like if you're proven wrong, you also have to have like some sympathy and like empathy for yourself, and like realize like you're human. Like we're all born. We have our instincts, but like we weren't given a to-do list on like or like how to live life, and like so you have to be like easy on yourself too, and like realize.
Well, and the realization that the mistakes too that you've made like are incredibly formative experiences. I know of no better teacher than failure. I really can't think of anything. Like every lesson that's really resonated with me, I've had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, so I teach gymnastics, and I was actually did a private lesson yesterday with this girl, and I told her, I'm like, I think I've learned more from my failures than my successes. Like, because the success, you do it right, you don't really remember that, but the failure like sits with you for a minute or so. Like at least with gymnastics, like you realize like, oh, this went wrong and that.
Right.
But yeah, I feel like the more failures I make, sometimes it like makes me happy, because like,
big time.
I'm like, great.
Okay.
I'm one step closer towards the truth, and two, it's just, I don't know, like I learned so much more from that. So
you mentioned empathy, and having empathy for the people that don't see the world the way you do too is a key component. So empathy for yourself and for others that you are sure are wrong and are fervently and passionately arguing, without any logic or whatever, like having some empathy for them because they're on that journey too.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
And you just like, with certain people, like, especially as I get out more and like stop just reading books and I'm on the internet, the more I interact with people, it's like, okay, I can see why they came to this conclusion, because say they grew up on like the south side of Chicago or like a poor, bad neighborhood. It's like, okay, I understand why you think this way. And it's like, you might be wrong, or maybe I'm wrong, but I think you're wrong.
Right.
But I also understand why you came to that conclusion, and like I'm not going to try to like destroy you with facts and try to change your mind.
Right.
It's like you just have
and you can still think they're wrong too.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of today's culture, I think we give a lot of that weight. Like we say experience matters, it totally does, but then that's the end of the conversation sometimes. Like, well, they had this experience, or like people are who they are because of their experiences and the different conditions and socioeconomic factors and stuff. But that's doing those folks a disservice, everyone a disservice, if we sort of end the debate there and say, well, I see the world this way because of this, therefore I must be right. Or this has credence, or that's enough. There's a huge trend in American culture toward that, and that's really poisonous, because that's a way to limit growth. Right. Totally.
You need the experience, but then you also need the objectivity and to see just not from your soul to eye perspective.
Right.
Like, see it from a bigger picture too. But
some of that validation can become this bubble.
And
then suddenly everyone's living in this little bubble because of their experiences or whatever.
Yeah.
Random aside, I feel the same way you do about mistakes too. I do a lot of like little home projects and stuff, which I really love to do, like self-taught, don't know what I'm doing. And everything always fails the first time. And I've gotten to the point where I don't care any longer. Like I've learned something super valuable, and I can remember being frustrated in time, like, but the older you get, I'm getting pretty old, RJ. The older you get, the more you realize like time will always be there, or won't. You can't control that time element. So if you've wasted time on something, like the lesson that resonates was worth that time. It totally was. There is this is totally an aside. There's a show of people trying to live in the wilderness called Alone. Have you heard of this at all? It's like a contest.
Is it on
dropped
Discovery
off an
Channel?
island, I think probably. Anyway, the people that always win this show, I've watched like half a season or something like that, but I watched the end of one. The dude who wins is the dude who didn't get frustrated, right? Like he didn't get down on himself for the mistakes. Everyone makes all these mistakes. I've seen it like twice now, because I knew who won this one season, and then this other season. I don't watch a ton of TV, but I do watch this. But it's the people, like you can see it in their total behaviors, like attitude like matters. Like, it totally matters. And so if you can get to that point where mistakes aren't a problem or like a personal failure, but a growth opportunity, you will be able to survive in the wilderness for 180 days with a candle or whatever they come out there with.
If you
You're
get
unstoppable.
frustrated, if you get frustrated and you stop, like, well, of course you're going to stop growing. Like you just stopped. Like, you're going to be stuck where you're at, like with the girls in gymnastics, like the ones who have that mindset. And I always try to get it in all their mindsets, but the ones that like, there's one girl I remember, she was still doing what we were telling her to do, but she was also crying. But I'm like, no, like you're doing an amazing job. Like that mindset, like what you're doing, like, yes, you're crying and you're frustrated, but you're still trying. Like that's what I would rather see than you doing like a double backflip, like
being good at it or not natural at it or
exactly
whatever, right?
Like that mindset will take you much farther than anything.
Growth mindset, I think is what they call it.
And that's what I try to have, because I don't want to be stuck. And Like I want to grow and learn and
Yes.
find the truth. And
It's hard.
And that's why like I started this. Like I was trying to get this set up all perfect and like, oh, if I get these microphones and this, I gotta work after that. I'm like, you know what? Like no, just get the questions. I'll come here. We'll set it up.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not gonna go perfect. It's my first time. So
right,
but I'm
right.
just gonna learn as I go.
Sure.
And eventually maybe it'll be like Joe Rogan. It'll be all fancy and
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Even if just 100 people watch.
Yeah,
even
oh heck
10,
yeah.
I don't care. Like,
yeah.
I'm doing this kind of more so for me. So.
When I recorded these when I first started teaching U.S. history, it was actually face to face, but I still wanted to capture lectures. I wanted to do a flipped classroom. So I wanted students to like watch lectures outside of class and then come to class back in Texas. So I recorded these lectures like way back in like 2014. Actually, spent all summer working on the project. Like they're like really low quality, but like it found an audience. It's not crazy, but it's like 250,000 views or something like that on these old YouTube videos. Partly it's just because the channel's been around so long or whatever.
Oh yeah, but still.
But like it was just a guy in Texas with like this little cheap little microphone, like figuring out how to record stuff.
Yeah.
And I got all these people start commenting on these videos like, you saved me in AP U.S. history. Like it found an audience beyond me. Yeah. Which is the power of the internet totally. Yeah. So if 100 people watch it, that's 100 lives. You might have changed to some extent, right? Or listened. So.
And that's what I want to do, but. So finally, any books you recommend or people you'd recommend listening to like learn more about this or?
I think the thing, rather than any specific recommendations, I don't do nearly as much reading as I should offline. I buy books and they just sit on the shelf. One day I'll read them. Yeah. But you got to listen to the people you disagree with, like fully. Like even if like your head is screaming that they're totally wrong. You got to listen to the full point. Yeah. So if you seek out different opinions, like eventually you're going to find someone who is right and you are wrong. Yeah. And like that experience, it's the same theme we've been talking about this whole time. Like seek out contrarian opinions. Yeah. Seek out someone who thinks the opposite of you on a specific topic. See what they believe about others. Try to talk to them if you can. I think of Twitter, just how useful Twitter is for me for just following different people and just seeing how they think. You get to see you get to hear perspectives you would not hear on the television screen, right? Or even potentially in books, like the bestsellers list is going to have a specific, in the same way that CNN or Fox News is sort of one perspective, that New York Times bestsellers is probably generally an acceptable view within this political framework. Right. Specifically, that might not expand your point of view at all. So seek out contrarians would be sort of my big piece of advice. If something is shocking or surprising to your perspective, listen. Yeah. Right. And then see where that takes you.
Yeah, I think that's a good recommendation just because for two reasons. Like I remember Nietzsche said some quote, I don't know exactly what it is, but like there's truth, there's love and truth, or truth and chaos, but there's also chaos and truth. So it's like they might not have everything right, but there might be like a little bit of like a golden nugget in what they're saying.
Totally.
You might like see it a different way. But even if there's not, if they're wrong, you should listen to them because it's also going to like help your arguments and like help better you and understand your own point of view. So.
And understand them better too. Because like you said earlier, something about like when you actually get to know someone or hear their perspective, you can maybe understand like where they're coming from or some nuance to their argument that's not evident when they're all fired up and yelling about something. Yeah. So listening to the whole point and asking questions and following up helps you understand their perspective better. Whether it means that you like empathize more or whether you feel like they're closer to the truth or not, it's almost irrelevant. At least you understand them fully. Right. And then you're actually having a policy or a philosophical debate. You're not having a debate about semantics or whether that part of it was true or not. Right. Like that doesn't matter. It's like why are they arguing what they're arguing and why do they think that, and giving them the space to represent their own. Because if people have that opportunity, that's how we do get closer to the truth, even if we're super divided. If we can be heard fully, people just want to be heard, right?
I think that's a huge thing. Is people just want like to be acknowledged.
And then the full idea is in public, right? Then they haven't been misunderstood. Yeah. Then it's up for debate. Then government can do something about it or not, right? Then the best ideas sort of move forward because we understand them fully.
Yeah. Dang. Well.
That's fun.
That's all I got. So I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Interview me in 2 years and see if I say the exact same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I'll probably come back and say the opposite. Democracy's great. What did I say?
Exactly. Well, thank you, Jordan.
You're welcome,
Mr. O'Connell.
You're welcome. That's cool.